1996's The Divide: Enemies Within for the PS1 had grand ambitions and an intriguing premise. Moreover, it acts as a potential answer for one of the biggest what-if questions from the 32 and 64-bit generation of gaming. Why then did it fall into practically complete obscurity almost immediately after release? This is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not widely considered classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. Being fully upfront, this video was difficult to research. When I said that the game fell into almost complete obscurity, I meant it. This is the Wikipedia page for the game. No, really, that's all of it. There's only one walkthrough on GameFAQs, and it's not even a full walkthrough. It's just a how-to for the bosses, and that wasn't put up there until 2020. Seriously, aside from a decent write-up and interview with Ian Vercher, the game's main designer, on Hardcore Gaming 101, there is next to nothing out there on this game. No manual, no maps, nothing. The only reason I knew anything about the game prior to researching this video is because, in the 90s, I used to religiously buy EGM and GamePro, and was, paradoxically, intrigued by their reviews of the game. But we'll get to that. This obscurity isn't entirely the game's fault, though. The game was developed by Radical Entertainment, which has released some fantastic, well-known games more recently, such as The Simpsons Hit and Run, Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction, and the Prototype games. At the time of The Divide's release, though, their output was a little more questionable. By that I mean that Radical kind of had a rare during the NES era thing going on, where there were the games they wanted to make, like The Divide, and then there were the licensed games they seemed to have squeezed out for the paycheck, like the NES version of The Terminator, Independence Day for the PS1 and Saturn, and the lowest reviewed game in Nintendo Power history, Bebe's Kids for the SNES. Okay, so their track record with licensed games was hit or miss. The Divide was an original game though, and something of a passion project for the developers, so what happened? As Vercher tells Hardcore Gaming 101, one of the biggest issues with the game's release is that Viacom New Media, the game's publisher, went under the day the game was to ship. He doesn't elaborate past that, but it's not hard to imagine that a turn of circumstance like that would make widespread availability for the game just a tad more difficult. Just a tad. Moby Games claims that the label would appear throughout 1997 as the rest of its games were finished releasing, but that's hard to verify, especially since it has The Divide releasing in both 1996 and 1997, depending on where you're looking. For this video, based on both copyright dates and some of the reviews of the game, we're sticking with 1996. On that note, remember those reviews I mentioned? The ones that made me aware of the game and oddly fascinated with it? Yeah, they weren't actually the most glowing of endorsements. GamePro, despite giving the game average scores, derided it for having enemies that are too difficult, graphics that are too blocky, and jittery controls. The EGM reviewers claimed that there was an intriguing story and interesting soundtrack, but they were in service to a middling sci-fi platformer. The reason I became fascinated by the game reading these reviews is because they seemed at odds with themselves. They talked about the core experience being an interesting and, for the time, unique one, but also that the actual gameplay wasn't doing that same experience any favors. This came across as weird to me, and so I've been interested in the game ever since. These reviews also probably weren't doing the game any favors when it came to exposure, considering the issues it was already facing. Here's the thing though, they're not entirely wrong about the divide between experience and gameplay. Yeah, I'm sorry. Anyway, while not wrong, all of the reviews are more than a little misleading. See, they all imply that the game is a platformer, maybe not in the vein of Mario 64 or Bubsy 3D, but definitely similar to something like Contra Legacy of War, and that's not the case. Instead, the player navigates maze-like areas, searching for weapons and upgrades which serve to unlock progression to, and ensure survival in, other, more difficult, more complicated areas. I absolutely described a Metroidvania just now, didn't I? It wouldn't be entirely fair to call The Divide a Metroidvania though, since Castlevania Symphony of the Night wouldn't be released for another year after The Divide's launch, coming out on March 20th, 1997. No, it would be fairer to drop the Vania and to just call The Divide an attempt at a 3D Metroid, a comparison which is by no means a coincidence. In that same Hardcore Gaming 101 interview, Vercher said that he tried to sell the game to publishers as Super Metroid in 3D, and a lot of the game reflects that approach. For one thing, Tonkin, the protagonist and player avatar, is in a mech that looks like a cross between Samus Aran's battle armor and Galoob's Z-Bots from the early 90s. And you're welcome for the reminder that Z-Bots were a thing. For another, there are areas with extreme temperatures which require the player to hunt down upgrades in order to traverse them, something we need to discuss in more detail. Then there's the, well, energy tanks, missile upgrades, and bomb upgrades, called grenades here, all very clear callbacks to the Metroid franchise. These clear ties to Metroid make the game particularly fascinating because there would be no official entry in the Metroid series during this generation of consoles. In fact, it would be almost a decade between Metroid games at the time. Super Metroid was released in 1994, 2 years prior to The Divide, but Metroid Prime wouldn't see release until 2002, 6 years after The Divide and 8 years after Super Metroid. This despite the tease that many took Samus' appearance in the N64 Super Smash Bros. To be in 1999. At the very least, her appearance in that game got people speculating about what a Metroid game for the N64 would look like. The Divide. It would look like The Divide. Well, sort of. I say sort of because for all of the Metroid things the game does, it is definitely still its own thing, for both good and ill. First things first, there's a matter of size, because the comparisons between Tonkin and Samus aren't exactly one-to-one. Yes, Tonkin and Edwina, Tonkin's partner, wear environmental suits along the lines of Samus, but that's not what the player takes control of. Instead, as indicated in the intro cutscene, the player controls the giant mech into whose head Tonkin is inserted. Assuming that Tonkin and Edwina are average human size, although there's no particular context to make this assumption, just work with me here, that means that all of the enemies, and particularly the boss encounters, are absolutely massive in scale. Sure, Metroid has its fair share of large bosses to fight, but they are nothing compared to the bosses present here. It's no wonder all of the enemies are so hard to take down. Which is actually one of the issues with the game. Every enemy is a damage sponge, so the rapid fire that the primary weapon has is absolutely necessary for every encounter, throughout the game. This base weapon doesn't get any power upgrades either. It's either that, or one of the secondary weapons, which are more powerful, but are also all restricted by limited ammo. This issue peaks with the penultimate boss of the game, which we're just going to cover up here because spoilers, but don't worry, we are definitely coming back to in a little bit. This battle alone took, no joke, over 15 minutes to finish, and I got lucky to be able to do so that quickly. After I ran out of ammo for my secondary weapons, I managed to luck into a position where the boss got caught on the environment, which meant I was in no real danger of losing. It was still a good 13 minutes of just standing there, holding down the fire button, until the boss was finally defeated. Fine-tuned balancing, this was not. Speaking of not being well balanced, we need to talk about the overall level design because certain aspects are not great. The save rooms are a good example of this issue. They seem to have just been placed haphazardly with no consideration for where they are in relation to important areas of the game. You would think that, at the very least, it would be common sense to place a save point near the boss battles in the game. You'd think that. You'd be wrong though. In one instance, I lost close to an hour's worth of gameplay because I died during the boss battle in the Jungle Gorge region of the game, a region that has no save spots whatsoever. For context, there are 6 regions in the game, equivalent to Brinstar, Norfair, and Meridia in Super Metroid. Now, imagine, say, moving through the entirety of Brinstar and not finding a single save spot. Similarly, in Super Metroid, the developers were considerate enough to include health replenishment stations near the save spots. Again, not here though. In fact, throughout the entire game, I found a grand total of 2, and it's not like I didn't explore. I finished the game with 89% completion, so yeah. What this means is that if you're low on health or ammo, there is going to be a lot of grinding. To be fair, that could still be considered a callback to Metroid, just the original Metroid on the NES. Considering how resilient the enemies are here though, it can get very time-consuming. The other side of this is that there is an interesting amount of thought put into the biomes that each region represents. Keeping in mind that the Divide is a massive chasm gouged into a large part of the planet's surface, it's interesting that, as the player descends further into the abyss that is the Divide, the more hostile the environments become. This doesn't mean that the enemies become more hostile, although there is that too. It means that the environments become increasingly inhospitable to sustaining life. Well, regular life, that is. That's part of the discussion about the game's story, though. Either way, the further you descend, the less vegetation is present, the more extreme the temperatures, and the more barren and dangerous movement around these environments becomes. It's a cool bit of recognition in terms of how something like the Divide would actually work, and an interesting bit of environmental storytelling. Let's talk about the mech again for a minute though, because there are a few aspects to it that make controlling it wholly unique to controlling Samus. One thing to take into account is that, while yes, this was an attempt at Metroid in 3D, this was also an attempt at Metroid in 3D during the early days of 3D in video games. Because of that, trying to align your fire to hit either ground or flying enemies was something that hadn't really been worked out yet, and the Divide's approach, while slightly janky, still works and makes sense in story. See, the L1 and L2 shoulder buttons change the angle of fire up or down respectively. This is not a smooth arc, however. Instead, there are 3 angles, either up or down, along with firing straight ahead. This might sound limiting, and yeah, it kind of is, but the game doesn't throw anything at the player that can't be taken out by one of these angles. Plus, it makes sense in the context of a giant mech, especially one that is more Mech Warrior than Gundam. All of Tonkin's movements in the mech are jerky and mechanical, as though powered by hydraulics. Because of this, the notion that there are only certain set angles that the mech can adjust weapon aiming to works as a parameter of the vehicle Tonkin, and by extension the player, is piloting. Another way that the mech distinguishes itself from Samus's power armor is through what upgrades Tonkin finds are necessary. For example, starting out, Tonkin's mech cannot jump, because the hydraulics unit for that function has been irreparably damaged. Therefore, one of the first upgrades the player finds is a replacement unit for the jump function. The game takes it further though, because that isn't the first upgrade given to the player. No, when the player first starts out in the game proper, Tonkin's mech has been so badly damaged that the hydraulics for the leg's basic walking has been almost completely destroyed. The first order of business for the player is finding a replacement unit so that the mech can walk instead of limping along. Not only is this an interesting way of distinguishing the mech from Samus, but also of establishing the level of damage both Tonkin and Advina suffered during their first encounter on the surface of the Divide. Because of that, the ability to navigate frozen or scorching environments isn't tied to obtaining new suits, as it is with Metroid, but replacing the heating and cooling units in the mech respectively. The mech does not have an equivalent to Samus's Morph Ball though. While that makes sense since the Morph Ball is for tiny enclosed spaces, and the mech is enormous, it still would have been nice if the mech had had some sort of transformation aspect to it. Let's go back to the jumping though, because oh my, do we need to talk about the platforming in the game. The platforming makes up a good 80% of the game, and I hope that someday I will have the sheer unmitigated confidence / audacity of whoever designed the platforming. There are a lot of places in the game where extremely fine, precision platforming is required for progression. But there's a problem with that. The actual jumping mechanics aren't designed for that. When jumping from a standstill, there is a delay between pressing the button and the actual jump. This is because the hydraulics powering the jump take that time to engage. This doesn't happen if the player jumps while moving because the leg hydraulics are already engaged, so this is clearly a case of world building interfering with game design, which, while not great, is at least understandable. What is less understandable is the precise timing needed for the double jump, which is an upgrade the player gets about halfway through the game. While the double jump can be activated at any point during an initial jump, the timing is the difference between actually gaining double height or distance and simply not falling right away. Now, this would be frustrating enough in its own right, but there are 2 other factors which push the platforming over into infuriating. The first is actually a limitation, not of the game, but of the hardware at the time. Remember, the Divide released in 1996, at least a year before analog controls came to the PS1 in the form of the original DualShock controller. This means that moving diagonally becomes awkward and a little difficult because you need to press left or right while also pressing up or down at the same time on the D-pad. The level designers knew that this sort of movement would be tricky, and intentionally made a bunch of areas where there are narrow platforms that need to be traversed diagonally, which, thanks for that. This gets particularly frustrating in the Ice Chasms region, where the player has to deal with a combination of these tricky inputs, and, because it's an ice area, sliding on platforms. Sure, the player does get an item that keeps Tonkin from these frictionless frolics, but that only comes near the end of the ice chasms, where it's practically useless except for backtracking. Perhaps the worst example of this issue with moving diagonally, though, comes in the lava rift region near the end of the game. Some sadistic one of the more confident devs thought it would be a good idea to have an entire area where the player has to make precise, running, diagonal, double jumps from platform to platform suspended near the ceiling. What this means is that if the player is even a fraction off in the direction pointed, the timing when initially jumping, or the timing with the double jump, then the player is going to fall. A lot. From a great height. Which highlights the other issue with the platforming. Fall damage. You could argue that, with the harder-edged sci-fi aesthetic that the Divide is going for, fall damage makes sense, which, okay, fair enough. However, it also only makes sense if the actual jumping and platforming is tight enough, or the level design isn't vertical or punishing enough, that fall damage isn't going to be the player's main antagonist in the game. So many times I found myself farming health because of repeated missed jumps and the inevitable fall damage, and this was after I had gotten multiple energy tanks. Whew, okay. It felt good to vent about that. At this point, because I keep dancing around it, let's talk about the game's story. Before we do, we're gonna go ahead and call a spoiler alert here. No, really, I know this is an almost 25-year-old game, but it's obscure enough that I am genuinely concerned about spoiling it, because chances are you haven't come across anything discussing it. Still here? Okay, you can't say I didn't warn you. Now, here's the thing with the story. Both EGM and Retro Gamer Magazine praised the game for its story, with EGM going so far as to ask, can a video game win a Hugo Award? And, are we playing the same game? Because the story is not particularly well told. The ideas present are interesting and thought-provoking, but the implementation definitely leaves something to be desired. To be fair, the opening cutscene is well done. The voiceover narration is significantly higher quality than typical video game voice acting of the time, which makes sense as it was provided by Eric Schneider, who worked on various episodes of the 90s version of The Outer Limits and played Dr. Mackenzie on Stargate SG-1. The cutscene establishes that Tonkin and Advina are space explorers, casting Tonkin as a destroyer and Advina as a creator. They come to the Divide, launch automated probes, and descend to the surface in their mechs, where they are then attacked by a native creature who has been, what do we want to call it, adversely affected by one of the probes? Advina gets taken away by the probe-empowered creature, while Tonkin's mech is critically damaged and left to the elements. This forces Tonkin into suspended animation for an indeterminate amount of time. When eventually thawed out, Tonkin is determined to set forth into the Divide and rescue Advina. Yeah, that's right. For all the sci-fi set dressing, the story boils down to a damsel in distress narrative, despite neither Tonkin's nor Advina's gender being identified. Well, sort of. See, there's a twist to all of this, but it doesn't come until the very end of the game. Most of the game just leaves you to your own devices in your search to rescue Advina, with no additional overt story beats encountered. It isn't until you face the penultimate boss of the game that something more, and more interesting, is done with the damsel in distress narrative. Let's go ahead and remove that spoiler alert sticker from earlier now, because that penultimate boss is a creature of the Divide, wearing the headless body from Advina's mech. This clues the player into what's really happening with the game's enemies and its story, and the developers really wanted the player to know it. Rather than relying on players being smart enough to recognize Advina's mech, they heavy-handedly state outright what's going on by slapping a bunch of text up on screen before the boss fight. This is particularly egregious because this is the first actual storytelling attempt since the beginning of the game. Anyway, after that fight, the player encounters a mech that is essentially a large, mean knockoff of the ones Tonkin and Advina pilot, before coming face to face with a generator powered by the head of Advina's mech. After defeating the generator, which was powering all of the mechanical elements encountered throughout the Divide, the player is then informed, again via way too obvious text, that Advina was lost ages ago. Remember that indeterminate amount of time Tonkin spent in suspended animation mentioned earlier? It turns out that it was a matter of eons, and that all of the biomechanical aspects of the enemies and the world of the Divide were the result of evolution heavily influenced by the technology of Advina's mech and the probes launched to the surface. In other words, the player character is directly responsible for all of the enemies and obstacles found throughout the game. This is driven home by the final encounter in the game, where the player discovers Agen, an enormous humanoid wearing a helmet similar to the heads of Tonkin and Advina's mechs. The player finds out at this point that Agen is not just the one hindering all of Tonkin's attempts to find Advina and the probes, but is also the narrator heard at the beginning of the game. This frames some of the opening narration in a new context. See, without the foreknowledge that it is Agen speaking, the narrator is assumed to have a certain level of omniscience. Knowing that it's Agen, on the other hand, suddenly naming Tonkin as the Destroyer and Advina as the Creator takes on a whole new meaning. Advina is the Creator because everything in the Divide has literally been created and given at the very least a semblance of sentience by the technology provided by Advina's mech and the probes. This includes Agen, as is directly stated in the ending narration, if the player makes the right choice. See, Tonkin being designated the Destroyer is because of the player's actions throughout the game. None of the enemies Tonkin and the player encounter survive the confrontation, and the player is even given the choice to be vengeful or merciful with Agen during the final encounter. If the player spares Agen, Tonkin is aided in escaping the collapse of the Divide since it is no longer powered by Advina's mech. If, however, the player chooses vengeance and kills Agen, Tonkin does not receive Agen's aid in escaping and is wiped out along with all of the other hybrid life in the Divide's collapse. Either way, it is the perception of a denizen of the Divide which designates the titles of Creator and Destroyer to Advina and Tonkin respectively, based on their influence on the Divide itself. Interestingly, this dynamic in the Divide also highlights an issue with its inspiration. Throughout the Metroid franchise, Samus is never on a mission of mercy. She is a bounty hunter, and the closest she comes to a mercy or vengeance decision in any of her games to that point is sparing the lone Metroid hatchling in Metroid 2, after being tasked with a Metroid genocide on their home planet. As much as the Metroid franchise is about exploration, it is also equally about extermination. There is no rescue, there is no clemency, there is only eradication. The Divide takes that notion and explicitly incorporates it into its take on the sci-fi idea of space colonization, which, in this case, is inextricably linked with the destructive nature of colonialism. The Divide is a game that offers some interesting ideas and experimentation, even if that experimentation isn't entirely successful. Despite its flaws, it offers an intriguing premise with thought-provoking concepts. As well, it is an interesting take on the question of, what if the N64 had gotten a Metroid game? Moreover, it offers a more critical take on the Metroid narrative and certain sci-fi standards that have become staples of the genre. Because of its ambitions, especially in the early days of 3D gaming, it deserves to be better known than it is, and more than makes for a good weekend rental.
You know what scares me the most? When I can't fight it anymore. When it takes over. When I totally lose control. I like it.